The wind had been screaming for 3 straight days when Thomas Hutchins realized his family was going to die. Their cabin was already below freezing. Their firewood was gone. His youngest child had stopped crying because she no longer had the strength. Outside, the temperature had fallen past 40 below zero. The snow was moving sideways. No man should have been outside for more than a few minutes. But Hutchins tied a rope around his waist anyway, then around his wife, then around each of his children, and he led them into the storm, walking blind through white darkness toward the only place he could think of that might still be warm. A neighbor's cabin. A cabin where a man had done something everyone said was insane. He had dug a hole in his own floor and slept in the ground like an animal. And that night, in the worst blizzard Montana territory had ever recorded, that hole in the ground was the only thing standing between 5 people and frozen graves. This is the story of Samuel Bridger, the trapper they mocked, and the winter that proved he was right. Before we continue, a quick reminder. More than 99% of people watching stories like this never subscribe. If you enjoy true frontier survival stories, hitting subscribe really helps this channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more stories like this. The winter of 1867 would claim 43 lives across the Montana Territory before the thaw finally came in late March. But in a crude homestead 7 miles west of what would one day become Helena, a solitary trapper named Samuel Bridger slept through the worst blizzard in recorded frontier history, wearing nothing but his wool union suit, comfortable as a man in his own bed on a spring morning. His neighbors, those who survived, would later swear they'd seen him emerge from his cabin in shirt sleeves while the thermometer read 38 degrees below zero. They'd called him mad that autumn when he dug his pit. They'd laughed when he tunneled into his own floor like some sort of human badger. But after that winter, after the wind stopped howling and the bodies were counted, nobody laughed at Samuel Bridger again. Bridger had arrived in the territory 3 years earlier, a quiet man in his late 30s with the weathered hands of someone who understood hard work. He'd trapped beaver along the Missouri River tributaries, traded with the Salish when relations allowed, and kept to himself in the way that men on the frontier often did when they carried memories they'd rather not speak about. He'd spent his first 2 winters in a conventional log cabin, 16 feet by 14, chinked with clay and moss, a stone fireplace dominating one wall. He'd burned through 5 cords of wood each winter, same as everyone else. He'd woken to ice on the inside of his windows, same as everyone else. He'd spent December through February in a constant cycle of splitting wood, feeding fires, and trying to stay warm enough to sleep, same as everyone else. But Samuel Bridger was a man who noticed things. He noticed how the root cellar, dug 8 feet into the earth behind his cabin, never froze even when the surface world turned to iron. He noticed how the potatoes and turnips stored there remained firm and unfrozen while the water in his cabin bucket turned to solid ice. He noticed the strange warmth that seemed to radiate from the earth itself once you got deep enough, as if the world was holding heat in its belly, keeping secrets from the brutal sky. Most men noticed these things and thought nothing of it. Bridger noticed and began to wonder. In September of 1867, as the aspens turned gold and the first cold winds began sliding down from the mountain passes, Bridger began to dig. Not outside his cabin, but inside it, right in the center of his single room. His nearest neighbors, the Hutchins family who'd staked a claim 2 miles south, heard about it when they came to trade for beaver pelts. Mary Hutchins told her husband that night that Bridger had finally lost his mind. Digging a grave in his own floor, she said, shaking her head. Mark my words, Thomas, that man won't see spring. The pit Bridger excavated was 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. Precisely measured, carefully carved through 2 feet of topsoil and 4 feet of clay-rich subsoil. He piled the excavated earth outside, covering it with canvas against the autumn rains. He lined the bottom with flat river stones, creating a level sleeping surface 18 inches above the pit floor. He left the walls bare earth, packed and smooth. The opening he left at ground level measured the same as the pit below, 6 feet by 4 feet, a perfect rectangular mouth in his cabin floor. Word spread through the scattered homesteads and trapping camps. Men came to see for themselves. They stood in Bridger's cabin, staring at the hole in his floor, and they tried to make sense of it. "You planning to bury yourself alive?" asked John Pritchard, who ran a trap line 15 miles north. Bridger just smiled his quiet smile and kept working. He was building a cover for the pit now, a frame of lodgepole pine fitted with a trapdoor that could be opened from below. The cover would sit flush with the cabin floor when closed. When open, a man could descend into the pit using carved footholds in the earth wall. He'll suffocate down there. The men agreed over whiskey at the trading post. Or freeze to death sleeping in a hole like some kind of animal. The conventional wisdom was absolute and unquestioned. Heat rises. Cold sinks. Everyone knew that. Sleeping in a pit below ground level meant sleeping in the coldest spot possible. It was madness. It violated everything frontier men understood about survival. But Bridger had spent 3 years thinking about that root cellar. He'd spent 3 winters watching his firewood supply dwindle, watching other men die when they ran out of fuel or got caught between their cabin and woodpile during a whiteout. He'd thought about the Salish people he'd met, who sometimes dug their winter lodges partially into the earth. He'd thought about bears in their dens, about how they survived months underground without fire. He'd thought about that strange, persistent warmth in his root cellar, present even on the coldest nights. And he'd reached a conclusion that every other settler would have called impossible. The earth itself was warm. Not hot, but warm. Consistently, reliably warm. Once you got deep enough below the surface, past the zone where winter's cold could penetrate, the temperature remained stable. Always. Regardless of what the air above was doing. Bridger didn't know the scientific terms. He didn't know about geothermal gradients or the Earth's internal heat. He just knew what he'd observed. 6 feet down, the Earth stayed warm. And if he could sleep 6 feet down, surrounded by that warmth, insulated by tons of soil from the killing cold above, he wouldn't need to burn himself through 5 cords of wood every winter. He might not need to burn any wood at all. By late October, the pit was complete. Bridger had refined his design with the careful attention of a man whose life would depend on getting the details right. The sleeping platform sat exactly 22 inches above the pit floor, creating an air gap beneath it. This gap, he reasoned, would trap warm air rising from the deeper earth and prevent any cold from seeping up through the stone. The walls he'd left as bare packed earth, but he'd sealed them with a mixture of clay and water, creating a smooth, slightly damp surface that wouldn't crumble or shed dirt onto his sleeping space. The cover frame he'd built from pine logs, solid and heavy, with gaps between the boards. These gaps were intentional. Air had to move. A man needed to breathe. But the gaps were narrow, less than half an inch, enough to allow air circulation but small enough that heat wouldn't rush out. The trapdoor in the cover was 2 feet square, positioned at the foot of where his sleeping platform sat below. He could open it from underneath using a leather strap, climb out in the morning, close it behind him. The carved footholds in the earth wall were deep and secure, tested repeatedly. He'd considered every detail. The moisture level of the earth walls, kept slightly damp to maintain their structure. The ventilation, carefully calculated to provide fresh air without creating a chimney effect that would suck warmth away. The sleeping platform height, positioned to capture the warmest air layer in the pit. He tested it on a cold October night when the temperature dropped to 15 degrees above zero. He descended into his pit at sunset, pulled the trapdoor closed above him, and lay on his platform in complete darkness. The earth surrounded him on all sides. The smell was clean, mineral, ancient. He'd brought a thermometer with him, a prized possession purchased at great expense from a traveling merchant. In the darkness, by candlelight, he watched the mercury, 54 degrees. While the cabin floor 6 feet above him registered 15 degrees, the pit held steady at 54. He blew out the candle and slept, covered with a single wool blanket, warmer than he'd been in any winter night in his cabin. He emerged at dawn to a world transformed. Frost covered every surface. His windows were sheets of ice. The water bucket was frozen solid. But he'd slept warm, deeply warm, the kind of sleep a man only got when his body wasn't fighting cold all night. He stood in his cabin, feeling the difference, knowing what he'd discovered. Then he started his fire, made his coffee, and said nothing to anyone. November came with snow. The first storm dropped 8 inches, then 12, then 16. The temperature plunged, 20 above zero, then 10, then zero itself. Bridger descended into his pit each night and slept in comfort. The earth temperature held steady, 53 degrees when the surface was zero. 52 degrees when the surface dropped to 10 below. The ground, it seemed, had no interest in what the air was doing. It kept its own counsel, maintained its own warmth, indifferent to the sky's fury. By December, talk of Bridger's pit had spread through the territory with the peculiar speed that strange news always traveled on the frontier. Men discussed it in trading posts and cabins, trying to understand what he was doing and why he wasn't dead yet. The Hutchins family, snowed in for 3 days during an early December blizzard, burned through a week's worth of firewood, keeping their cabin barely warm enough to survive. When the storm passed, Thomas Hutchins rode to Bridger's homestead, half expecting to find the man frozen in his hole. He found Bridger outside in shirt sleeves, splitting wood. Not much wood. A few pieces for cooking. The man looked rested, healthy, comfortable. His woodpile, Hutchins noticed, was barely touched. In December, while Hutchins' own woodpile had shrunk by a third and winter was just beginning. How? Hutchins asked, the word coming out sharper than he'd intended. Bridger set down his axe and invited Hutchins inside. He showed him the pit, explained the principle as best he could. The earth stays warm, Bridger said simply. Always has. Down deep enough, it doesn't know there's winter happening up here. I just sleep where it's warm instead of where it's cold. Hutchins stared at the pit, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed he knew about survival. You sleep in a hole, he said slowly. And you're warmer than me in my cabin with a fire burning. I'm warmer than you in your cabin with a fire burning, Bridger confirmed. And I'm not burning wood to do it. Earth does the work. Hutchins rode home in silence. He told his wife what he'd seen. She didn't believe him. It's unnatural, she said. A man should sleep above ground with a proper fire. That's how the Lord intended it. Hutchins wasn't sure what the Lord intended, but he knew his woodpile was running low and it was only December. He knew he had 2 young children who'd already suffered frostbite on their feet from the cold cabin floors. He knew that Bridger looked healthier and more rested than any man had a right to look in the middle of a Montana winter. But it was more than just health and rest. Bridger had discovered something that changed the entire equation of frontier survival. Firewood was the currency of winter. Everything else, food, water, shelter, tools, all of it was secondary to fuel. Men died when their wood ran out. Men died trying to cut wood in blizzards. Men died when snow got too deep to reach their woodpiles. The constant need for fire, the relentless consumption of fuel, the exhausting cycle of cutting, splitting, hauling, burning, that was what killed people. That was what broke bodies and spirits. And Bridger had found a way around it. You see, the physics of what Bridger had stumbled upon were elegant in their simplicity, even if he didn't know the scientific language to describe them. The Earth's temperature at 6 feet of depth remained relatively constant year-round, hovering between 50 and 55 degrees in that region. This temperature was maintained by geothermal heat from the Earth's core, radiating slowly upward, and by the Earth's thermal mass, its ability to absorb and store heat. The thick layer of soil acted as insulation, protecting the deeper Earth from the temperature swings happening at the surface. Winter's cold could penetrate down, but only so far. 6 feet was deep enough, in that climate, to escape winter's reach. The pit itself acted as a thermal battery. The earth walls, each one comprising hundreds of pounds of soil, radiated their stored heat into the enclosed space. The air in the pit, warmed by this radiation and by the warmer earth beneath the sleeping platform, created a stable microclimate. The cover prevented this warm air from escaping rapidly, while the small gaps allowed just enough air exchange to keep it breathable. A man sleeping in that pit was essentially sleeping inside a natural heating system powered by the earth itself, a system that required no fuel and no maintenance. The conventional cabins, by contrast, were losing heat constantly. Wood walls provided minimal insulation. Gaps and cracks let wind steal warmth. Heat from fires rose to the ceiling and then leaked out through the roof. The cold floor, in contact with frozen ground, drained heat from anyone standing on it. A man in a conventional cabin was fighting a losing battle, pouring heat into a space that was designed, almost perfectly, to shed it as quickly as possible. The fire had to burn constantly just to maintain a barely tolerable temperature. Stop feeding the fire, and within hours the cabin would match the outside temperature. Bridger's pit, by contrast, required no energy input. It simply existed in thermal equilibrium with the earth around it. The earth provided the heat. The design trapped and held it. A man sleeping there was not fighting winter. He was hiding from it, tucked into the warm belly of the ground itself, letting the planet do the work of keeping him alive. But understanding the physics didn't make the idea any less strange to frontier minds. Throughout December and into January, as the cold deepened and the snow piled higher, men continued to debate the wisdom of Bridger's approach. Some were intrigued. Most remained skeptical. A few were openly hostile, seeing in Bridger's pit a rejection of everything they understood about proper living. "A man ought to have a fire," became a common refrain. "It's not civilized, sleeping in the ground like that." Civilization, of course, had little to do with survival, but pride had everything to do with it. These were men who'd staked claims in brutal territory, who'd built cabins with their own hands, who'd faced down winters that killed weaker souls. They took pride in their fires, in their ability to cut enough wood, in their strength to endure. Bridger's pit suggested that all that effort might be unnecessary. It suggested that they'd been doing it wrong. And that was a hard thing for proud men to accept. January of 1868 came in cold. Not just regular cold, but the kind of cold that had a weight to it, a presence. The kind of cold that made trees explode in the night when their sap froze and expanded. 20 below zero became normal. 30 below zero was common. The world became a place of absolutes. Ice and wind and darkness and death waiting for any mistake. Men stayed close to their cabins. Fires burned day and night. Wood supplies shrank at alarming rates. The Hutchins family was struggling. Their cabin, well built by frontier standards, couldn't hold heat against the relentless cold. The children slept close to the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket the family owned, and still woke shivering. Thomas Hutchins was cutting through wood faster than he'd anticipated. At the current rate, he'd run out by late February. And if that happened, if his wood ran out with winter still raging, his family would die. It was that simple. Other families faced similar calculations. The Peterson clan, 8 people in a 20 by 16 cabin, burning 6 cords a month just to keep the temperature above freezing. The Morris brothers, 2 trappers sharing a crude shelter, already rationing their wood and sleeping in shifts to minimize fire time. The isolated homesteads scattered across the territory, each one an island of desperate heat in an ocean of cold, each one burning through finite resources while winter stretched ahead with no end in sight. And 7 miles from the Hutchins place, Samuel Bridger descended into his pit each evening and slept in comfort. He was burning perhaps a tenth of the wood his neighbors were consuming. He slept deeply, woke rested, spent his days maintaining his trapline and his supplies rather than desperately cutting wood. His thermometer, checked nightly in the pit, never dropped below 50 degrees. While the world above froze solid, his sleeping space remained steady, warm, alive. On January 19th, a massive storm system began moving down from Canada. The signs came first, a strange stillness in the air, a yellowish cast to the clouds, a pressure that made men's joints ache. Then the wind arrived. Then the snow. Not falling snow, but horizontal snow, driven by winds that shrieked like living things. The temperature plunged. 40 below zero, then 45, then 50. Thermometers stopped being useful. It was simply the coldest anyone could remember. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of howling wind and blowing snow and cold that turned exposed skin black in minutes. 4 days of darkness at noon, of visibility measured in feet, of every cabin becoming a sealed fort battling for survival. Fires burned full time. Men broke up furniture when their wood piles ran low. Women held children close, trying to share body heat. The wind found every crack, every gap, every weakness in every wall. The cold came in like water, flooding through defenses, claiming space inch by inch. Thomas Hutchins burned the last of his firewood on the 2nd day. Then he burned a chair. Then part of his table. His wife wrapped the children in every piece of cloth they owned. The temperature inside their cabin dropped to 20 degrees, then 15, then 10. The cold was a physical presence now, a thing that hurt to breathe, that made muscles seize and minds slow. Hutchins knew they were dying. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily, surely, freezing in their own home while the storm raged outside. On the 3rd day, in desperation, Hutchins made a decision. He wrapped his family in blankets, took a rope, and led them into the storm. 7 miles to Bridger's place. It might have been suicide. It probably was suicide. But staying meant certain death, so they went into the wind. Hutchins tied the rope around his waist, then his wife, then each child in turn. They formed a chain, blind in the blowing snow, and he navigated by memory and prayer toward where he believed Bridger's cabin stood. They nearly died 3 times. Once when Hutchins lost his bearings completely and walked in a circle for an hour. Once when his youngest child collapsed and had to be carried. Once when they stumbled into a ravine filled with snow and had to claw their way out. But somehow, more by miracle than skill, they saw the dark shape of Bridger's cabin emerge from the white chaos. Hutchins pounded on the door with frozen fists. Bridger opened the door to find a family more dead than alive. He pulled them inside, closed the door against the wind. His cabin was cold, maybe 35 degrees, because he wasn't burning a fire. He only lit fires for cooking, and he'd cooked that morning. The Hutchins family stood shaking, confused. They'd come seeking warmth and found a cold cabin. Mary Hutchins began to cry, thinking they'd traded one death for another. Then Bridger opened the trapdoor in his floor, and heat rose up. Not dramatic heat, not the blast from a fire, but steady, gentle warmth. "Get down there," he said simply. "All of you." They descended into the earth, into Bridger's pit, a family of 5 in a space meant for one. They huddled together on the stone sleeping platform, wrapped in their frozen blankets. And slowly, they began to thaw. The earth surrounded them, held them, gave them its warmth freely and without conditions. Within an hour, the children had stopped shivering. Within 2 hours, color had returned to faces that had been gray with cold. Mary Hutchins touched the earth wall beside her, feeling the warmth radiating from it, and began to understand what her husband had tried to explain a month ago. They stayed in the pit for 2 days while the storm finished its work above them. 5 people in 6 feet by 4 feet, sleeping in shifts, breathing air that smelled of earth and survival. Bridger slept in his cabin, giving them his pit, checking on them periodically, bringing down water and food. The thermometer in the pit registered 52 degrees throughout the storm. While the world above descended into a hell of wind and cold that would kill dozens, 5 people slept warm in a hole in the ground. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, the silence was shocking. Hutchins climbed out of the pit and opened the cabin door to a transformed world. Snow had drifted to the eaves in places. The cold was still brutal, 30 below zero in the clear air. But the wind had stopped, and the sun was shining, and his family was alive. He turned to Bridger, tried to find words for what he wanted to say, and found his throat too tight to speak. They dug their way back to the Hutchins cabin the next day. The interior was a frozen disaster, everything ice and destruction. But they were alive to see it. They would recover. And Thomas Hutchins, practical man that he was, immediately began planning his own pit. The news of the Hutchins family's survival spread quickly. Other families had not been so fortunate. The Morris brothers were found frozen in their cabin, their fire burnt out, their woodpile empty. A family of 4 named Webster, relative newcomers to the territory, had died together in their sleep when their inadequate cabin simply couldn't hold enough heat. An old trapper called French Pete had tried to ride out the storm in a snow cave and had simply never emerged. The death toll mounted as the snow melted and bodies were discovered. But 7 miles west of Helena, in a cabin that had required almost no firewood during the worst storm in memory, Samuel Bridger had survived comfortably. And in the same cabin, in a pit dug into the earth itself, 5 people who should have died had slept warm through the apocalypse. By February, 3 more families had dug pits in their cabins. By March, 7 more. The technique spread not through evangelism, but through desperate necessity. Men who'd mocked Bridger in autumn came to study his design in spring. They measured his pit, questioned him about ventilation and moisture and depth. They learned that 6 feet was the minimum, that drainage was crucial, that the cover needed gaps, but not large ones. They learned that the earth's warmth was real, measurable, reliable. They learned that everything they'd believed about survival had been incomplete. The transformation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't universal. Many settlers were too far from neighbors to hear about the technique. Many others couldn't bring themselves to dig up their cabin floors, couldn't overcome the psychological barrier of sleeping underground. But in the communities where the knowledge spread, winter survival changed fundamentally. Wood consumption dropped by 70% or more for families who built pits. The desperate cycle of cutting, hauling, burning eased. Children stopped dying from cold in their sleep. The equation of survival shifted in humanity's favor. Samuel Bridger himself became a reluctant expert. Men came to him with questions about depth and ventilation, about soil types and moisture control. He answered as best he could, sharing everything he'd learned. He helped families design their pits, advised on placement and drainage. He never charged for his help, never sought recognition. He was simply a man who'd noticed something, who'd thought about it carefully, and who'd been proven right by the cruelest winter in memory. The following winter, 1868 to 1869, was milder. But even in that milder season, the families with pits used a fraction of the wood their neighbors consumed. They slept better, worked less desperately, survived more easily. The winters after that varied, some harsh, some mild, but the pattern held. The earth pit, properly built, eliminated the most pressing danger of frontier life, the possibility of running out of fuel in the middle of winter. Bridger lived in his Montana cabin for another 12 years. He eventually married, though late in life, a widow named Catherine who thought his pit was the most sensible thing she'd ever seen. They raised 2 children there, both of whom slept warm through winters that would have killed earlier generations. The pit became a normal part of their home, as unremarkable as the fireplace or the door. When Samuel Bridger died in 1880, at the age of 51, from an infected wound sustained while trapping, his funeral drew people from across the territory. Men he'd helped, families he'd saved, children who'd grown up sleeping warm because of what he'd discovered. They buried him in the conventional way, above ground, in the small cemetery outside Helena. But they marked his grave with words that would have made him smile. He slept with the earth. The technique he pioneered spread far beyond Montana. Trappers carried it north into Canada. Homesteaders brought it south into Wyoming and Colorado. It evolved and refined over the years. Some builders added clay brick linings to their pits. Others experimented with depths beyond 6 feet, finding even more stable temperatures. A few ingenious souls created systems where warm air from their pits circulated through pipes to heat their cabins, creating some of the frontier's first geothermal heating systems. By the 1890s, when the frontier was closing and homesteads were becoming towns, the earth pit had saved an estimated 200 lives directly by providing shelter during extreme weather events. Indirectly, by reducing wood consumption and the associated dangers of wood cutting and hauling, it had likely saved hundreds more. It had made winter survival less desperate, less dangerous, less consuming of human energy and hope. The technique was eventually superseded by better building methods, better insulation, eventually by modern heating systems. But in its time, in that brief window when the frontier was raw and winters were deadly and men were learning to survive in brutal country, Samuel Bridger's sleeping pit represented a revolution. It was elegant. It was simple. It required no resources except labor and thought. And it worked. They stopped laughing that winter, the winter of 1867, when the temperature dropped to 50 below and the wind howled for 4 days straight. They stopped laughing when families emerged alive from holes in the ground while their neighbors froze in conventional cabins. They stopped laughing when they realized that the crazy trapper who dug a grave in his own floor had understood something fundamental about survival that all their conventional wisdom had missed. And in the years that followed, in the decades of frontier life that remained, they never forgot what Samuel Bridger taught them about listening to the earth, about questioning assumptions, about survival through observation rather than tradition. The earth had always been warm, waiting just beneath their feet. It had taken one quiet man, willing to dig, willing to be mocked, willing to trust what he'd observed over what everyone claimed to know, to show them how to reach it.